we settled back into our routines yet? Have we taken the lights down? Have we put the trees away? Is it looking a lot less like Christmas in your house? As for some, that's probably a pretty sad thing to say. We took our decorations down on Friday. I wasn't liturgically correct enough to get through Epiphany. You know, yesterday was the 12th day of Christmas, so it's still a good time to have your decorations up through yesterday, you know, if you want to be a real stickler for detail there. But didn't quite make it that far, but we are looking forward to what the new year is going to bring for us. Today is Epiphany, and it's kind of a strange day. We don't know what to make of it sometimes. It comes after Christmas, after the hoopla is dying down, and then there's this other day that's, in some traditions, lifted up a little bit more than it is in ours, and we've done some work to try to recover that, but we're still working on it. For all 3 years in our Revised Common Lectionary, our book of readings for this day, the text is the same, and it's the visit of the Magi, which we actually read last week from Matthew. So today, I'm going to use last week's text, which makes more sense chronologically. It follows in the life of Jesus. So we don't worry about the fact that the lectionary is a little bit out of order, at least chronologically. But from what I can gather, the visit from the Magi story is always on Epiphany because of what the day represents. The word is Greek, the word Epiphany. It comes from a root word that means to show. But Epiphany itself means revelation or manifestation. And in the Christian tradition, it represents the revelation of Jesus, especially to the Gentiles, who are represented by these visitors traveling from the east. But I think today's lesson can reveal as much about Jesus to today's Gentiles as the story of the Magi can. So let's turn now to Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, beginning at verse 41, and listen to what God has to say to us. Now, every year, his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. Now, this story from Luke is an artful stroke of storytelling. Luke is the most masterful of the gospel writers. He uses more sophisticated Greek vocabulary. He incorporates different literary styles. He skillfully arranges his material, much of it which is borrowed from Mark, some he has in common with Matthew, and some are unique to this gospel. And this is one of those stories. But that being said, you may have some questions about this story, such as, why did it take so long for Mary and Joseph to realize Jesus was missing? And why did they leave Jerusalem without realizing that he wasn't with them in the first place? I know parents in our time and place are often hyper aware of their kids' location, right? Perhaps even down to the GPS coordinates. You know, they make these little things now, I forget what they're called. You just stick it to something and you can find it wherever it goes. You want to do that to your kids, right? You just want to stick one on their temple and say, all right, I got you now. You're not going to be wandering off from me. In Jesus' lifetime, pilgrims to festivals in Jerusalem, like this one, traveled together on foot. There's safety in numbers, after all. But the most direct route from Nazareth to Jerusalem is 90 miles. The likeliest route that they probably took, avoiding Samaria, which was not the happy place for the Jewish faithful, is 120 miles. So, for such a long journey and with such a big group of folks, it might be understandable why you might not look for your tween son for a day or so. I was 12 years old once. I know what a pain in the tuchus I was at that age, so it wouldn't surprise me if my parents said, let him be. And like I said, today's lesson is the only story that we have of Jesus' childhood in the whole canon of Scripture. Luke is the only one who tells this story. It's a simple story, but with this surprising twist that offers a tantalizing glimpse of, for its audience, of the potential that Jesus shows. And as such, in reading it again, I began to think of the many stories we encounter of the Wunderkind, Wunderkind in the English pronunciation. That's a German term for child of wonder. And we see this sometimes in stories that people will refer to a Wunderkind. It's usually referring to someone who is older, who is especially talented in a particular field, but it can also apply to children. And there's other terms that we use for these sorts of gifted youth. You might hear phenom or child prodigy. That's the most popular one, I think. And stories of this type fascinate us because we wonder where their genius originates. You know, why these kids and not other kids? And how do they manage those gifts that they have? I went looking online for movies about gifted youth, and there are no shortage of them. Whether based on real people or entirely fictional, we love to tell and to listen to these stories. Good Will Hunting, Matilda, Harry Potter even, just a few examples. One of my favorite such films is based on a fellow who was baptized with these four names before his last name: Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus. If you know who that is, keep it to yourself for a moment. I was reading about this Wunderkind's life in an encyclopedia article about 7 famous child prodigies. But also in the list was this woman that was born in colonial Mexico about a century before this person. And her name was Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. She was born out of wedlock to a Creole mother and a Spanish father. And having little formal access to formal education in her hometown, she was largely self-taught. Her parents sent her to Mexico City to develop her gifts. And she loved learning more than anything else. She didn't even want to become married. She just wanted to learn. So she became a nun. She developed one of the largest private libraries in the New World. Sor Inés is now celebrated as one of the great writers of the Spanish-American colonial period. Her skills as a poet and a dramatist are still celebrated today. And her life reminds us that giftedness can show up anywhere, as the story of the Nativity reminded us a couple of weeks ago. But let's not forget our friend Johannes. The fourth of his 5 names, Theophilus, means friend of God. And incidentally, that's the same name that Luke uses in the introduction of his gospel. As he's laying out carefully his story, he's doing so addressed to this person named Theophilus, friend of God. Perhaps you will recognize this mystery phenom by the Latin version of this 4th name, Theophilus. That's the Greek version. Also means friend of God in Latin. and it's the title of that favorite film of mine concerning this individual. And the name is Amadeus. So if you guessed that, Amadeus, the movie about Mozart, as told by his rival, composer Antonio Salieri, give yourself 1,000 points. Yeah, see a couple people doing, oh yeah. These child prodigies come along constantly, of course, and one current example is a fellow named Magnus Carlsen. He is the reigning world chess champion for 5 years running. He's ranked number 1 and has been for 7 years. He became a chess grandmaster at the tender age of 13. Magnus is considered by many to be the greatest human chess player of all time. They even refer to him as the Mozart of chess. It's a fitting tribute to a prodigy of a different sort. And I'll take this moment now to plug our chess club, which meets at 1 o'clock today. We don't have any prodigies in our midst, so don't worry, you can come on up and feel competitive anytime. We can even teach you to play, it's fun. But whether the name is Mozart or Magnus or Sor Inez, such precocious children often have a difficult way in life. Mozart's family, or father rather, took his family on a tour throughout Europe. And you can bet that it wasn't simply to share the talents of this friend of God with the world. There was money to be made after all. As I mentioned, the parents of Sor Inez in Mexico were so overwhelmed by her gifts that they shipped her to Mexico City. Now, intellectually, this was doing her a favor, but at what cost to her emotional development? That's the tough dilemma that always faces parents of gifted children. Are they still children if they act like adults? In a world where their peers misunderstand them to the point of making fun of them, what is a concerned parent to do? Now, this wasn't the exact problem that was facing Mary and Joseph at the moment of this story. Yes, they were concerned, and greatly so, but they were worried more about where he was and that he was safe and sound rather than his social and emotional development. And what parent can't relate to that feeling? But in the aftermath of finding Jesus, and even being mildly rebuked by this precocious 12-year-old, Mary treasured these things in her heart as only Mary could. It's not the exact same word that Luke uses in the birth narrative, that she treasured these things in her heart, but the feeling is the same. Mary is one who's kind of a contemplative. She loved to think about things. And I wonder what she was thinking. Surely, based on the visit from the angel Gabriel before her pregnancy, Mary knew Jesus was special, but would Gabriel's promise of her bearing a son of the Most High have translated to having a tween who could debate with rabbis? If only there were a book called Raising Prodigies for Dummies, things might have been so much easier for Mary. Clearly, young Jesus had needed no such book for dealing with his giftedness. He knew instinctively that he had to be in his Father's house, a phrase that is more accurately translated as about my Father's business. He had to be concerned with what his true spiritual father was up to. As a 12-year-old, he was in the early stages of training for the work that was to come almost 2 decades later. Luke tells us a postscript to this story that Jesus increased in wisdom and maturity and in favor with God and people. Perhaps his personal epiphany, the discovery of his destiny, happened during that pilgrimage to Jerusalem. You know, we in the church have our own epiphany stories, to be sure. Perhaps you have an unforgettable episode of a moment of discovery of God's grace in your life, whether you translate that as a salvation experience or one where you really felt God being present with you in a time and place. Or maybe you simply have some collective insight gifted by the wisdom of maturity. Whatever the case may be, it's important for us to not overlook the fact that Jesus' own epiphany developed in part because of the religious devotion of his parents. They modeled faith for Jesus by going every year to this Passover festival, 240 miles round trip by foot. I did the math. That's more than 9 marathons. Some folks, we suppose, are child prodigies, are in fact the products of such devotion to a cause, be it work or education or church. And let's not forget the powerful combination that happens when God-given talent matches devotion of developing that talent. That happens in all areas of life, whether you are gifted with academic excellence, physical prowess, or maybe even caring for others in a special way. Surely that is what Jesus was telling his earthly parents by asking the question, "Why were you searching for me?" It's a disarming question, isn't it? Why were you searching for me? Jesus seems to be asking us that same question today. Why were you searching for me? Why are you searching for me? What epiphany do you expect to find? How might we answer that question? Would we say truthfully that we are also concerned with the Father's business? This son of Mary and Joseph, whose awareness as Son of God was developing, seemed to experience his personal epiphany in the course of accompanying his faithful parents during a pilgrimage, as I mentioned. So whether we are shepherding our own children in the church or honoring our vows as a congregation to shepherd the baptized children within it, we are, like the young Jesus, concerning ourselves with the Father's business. And when we come to this table that is set before us, we are about the Son's business too, as we celebrate his mysterious and lovely presence in our lives. May the gifts we are to receive at this table serve as our ongoing epiphany every time we receive them, a manifestation and a revelation of so much more than a prodigy in our lives. Let this bread and this cup reveal and manifest to us the real presence of salvation. Let us treasure it in our hearts now and always. Amen.